Hello, National University Virtual High School students and National University CSET students studying for your social science exams. We're going to go over some U.S. history. Just got a few questions from some students about the Good Neighbor policy, and I want to provide some background on the foreign policy that was established early on via the Monroe Doctrine, and how that was changed by first Theodore Roosevelt and then FDR. Let's look at first the Monroe Doctrine before we get into the Good Neighbor policy. So you have, of course, our early presidents. The fifth president, Monroe. You had, of course, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Jefferson had selected Madison from Virginia, and Madison had selected Monroe from Virginia. So you have the three successive Virginians in office. And Monroe takes his seat after the War of 1812. So you have the rivalry between the British, which is still ongoing, and as the United States is proving itself in its wars and showing that it can begin to have some scope over the territory around it, some idea of where it wants to go. The competition for the lands, including places like Florida and the Caribbean and Latin America, start to define themselves. So we see Spain's Latin American colonies revolting, and the United States takes a position in the 1820s of supporting, or first being neutral toward these insurrections and revolts, and slowly after the Adams-Onis Treaty, which ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, the United States realizes, okay, well, we can begin to expand, and if not expand, have a strategic interest in these countries so that we can maybe watch them a little bit more closely and guard them so that the European powers don't start to colonize them and control the ports of entry. So Henry Clay's oratory in Congress starts to drum up support as well for the Spanish colonies that are in revolt, and this leads to a resolution of sympathy with the Latin American revolutionaries, and thereafter Monroe in 1822 is going to recognize Mexico and Colombia as legitimate states, and then Chile and Argentina in 1823. Thereafter, the Brazil and Peru will be officially recognized. Basically, this was before the Monroe Doctrine is fleshed out. It's just him simply saying, yes, these are states that we have relationships with, and he's giving a nod to Great Britain, Russia, and Spain, that if you're going to start to intervene in these countries, we're going to be there watching, or we might actually intervene ourselves. What's also going on in Europe right now is this is post-Napoleon I, and the Grand Alliance has, under Prince Clement von Metternich and others, is being formed. This alliance under Alexander I, or with Alexander I, he's an opponent of Latin American democracy. Remember, the Grand Alliance in Europe basically said to the Napoleonic ideas of turning these countries over to the people was that Napoleon was trying to democratize these places too quickly. He was giving over too much power to the people in these regions, and establishing the legitimate monarchs was the purpose of one of the purposes of the Grand Alliance. The idea being that the legitimate monarchs were better than some ragtag democracy trying to solve the problems of state. So Russia is also looking at some of these countries. The United States is saying, well, you know what? We have a feeling of amity toward these revolting countries because we didn't want British rule over us. So Henry Clay and others are saying, hey, look, these countries were like we were years ago, or like we were before the Revolution. They want to be free from tyranny. They want to be free from their colonial oppressors. So Adams is really the guy who's going to draft and draw up and write what is known as the Monroe Doctrine. So it should be called, in many ways, the Adams Doctrine, but it gets the name Monroe Doctrine because Monroe was president at the time. He distrusted the British and moved unilaterally to eliminate them from the Monroe Doctrine writings. And on December 2nd, 1823, in Monroe's annual message to Congress, written by Adams again, he is going to lay out what is the Monroe Doctrine, basically saying that the United States will not intervene in Latin American affairs, and the European powers should do the same, stay out of their business. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary is going to change that. The Roosevelt Corollary is going to come along and say, hey, we've been watching the Latin American states, the Caribbean states, and we think that some of you mismanage your politics and your money, and we're going to intervene and we're going to step in. So it's really, in many ways, it doesn't change the Monroe Doctrine. It goes against it in some fundamental ways. And how did this happen? The Caribbean protectorates were subsidized, some to keep them dependent on the United States and other European countries. And the United States saw this, so hey, wait a second, how are these nations going to be free if they are beholden to their European debtors? So to keep the islands out of the hands of the European powers, such as the Danish West Indies, which would become the U.S. Virgin Islands, the steps toward the Roosevelt Corollary basically said, okay, what we're going to do is start to manage, go in and take over some of these ports and these governments and manage them, help them solve their economic problems. So from 1903 to 1920, the U.S. intervened in Latin America to protect the canal, of course, the Panama Canal. Latin American countries owed money and were poor and prone to revolution, many of them, that is. And they owed the European nations and banks. So the U.S. said, well, we don't want these nations to step in and take over. 1904, the Dominican Republic defaults, and the Roosevelt Corollary says that the Latin American countries should keep their affairs in order or face American intervention. Right after that, in 1905, Roosevelt takes over the Dominican Republic. He collects customs taxes and oversees payment of debt. So the United States goes in and takes over. This is going to be, the Lodge Corollary is going to be added to this, the Lodge Corollary, and this is going to be the foreign corps the foreign corporations could not buy harbors. In other words, they couldn't buy what would become possible military outlets for either the United States or its allies. So they didn't want corporations coming in and buying the harbors and the rights to the harbors. So then, what is the good neighbor policy? This gets to Brian's question that was asked yesterday. In 1920, it dismantled interventions of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and it's post-World War II. The Depression hits, and then in 1933 we see FDR take his seat, and he is going to, with the help of Secretary of State Cordell Hull, sign a pledge of non-intervention in the Panama-American Conference in Uruguay. And Hull signs this, and it's kind of it goes against the Roosevelt Corollary. It says we're not going to intervene in Latin American affairs. We're going to let the Latin American governments solve their own problems. This is going to lead to the articulation of the good neighbor policy, because you have Harding and Coolidge and Hoover before him, where the Marines are being taken out of places like the Dominican Republic. They're not needed there anymore. In 1924, the last detachment leaves Nicaragua. Actually, they had to go back a year later, but we won't go into that. The Clark Memorandum in 1930 condemned the Roosevelt Corollary, saying that the Monroe Doctrine says the Monroe Doctrine says the United States cannot intervene. So the Roosevelt Corollary, the Monroe Doctrine, really goes against the Monroe Doctrine fundamentally. So this leads to a cooperation and friendship understanding, which, according to FDR, is better than threats and armed intervention. This leads to new trade opportunities. Now, Mexico initially nationalizes its oil, and this is a setback for the United States, but right away the new trade opportunities open up, and the United States starts to make some money on the deal. It increases its sales to Latin America by 4 times, and investments begin to rise. So that was the good part of the good neighbor policy. In order to understand good neighbor policy, you have to understand the earlier ones. Thank you for listening. Talk to you soon. Bye.